Hello and welcome back to Tits, Tums and All Things Mum. I am here again with the lovely Harriet Shearsmith. How are you?
Hello, I'm good. How are you?
I'm very good. Welcome back on. Is this your third or fourth time now?
I think it's the third. This is the third.
Yeah, amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming back on. Could you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Harriet Shearsmith. I am first and foremost mum of three. I have teens, tweens, and I'm also an author, a podcaster, a content creator. I feel like I kind of wear lots of little hats. I'm also a coach and a trainee therapist as well, which is kind of my new venture. And I'm loving that. I'm loving working with people. And that's very specific to the topic that we are talking about today with cycle breaking parents and cycle breaking parenting, being someone who perhaps has had a childhood that they don't want for their own children and how they're going to make those changes in their lives and in their parenthood.
Yeah, definitely. So the times that I've had you on my podcast before, it's kind of gone through your content creation. Like we've spoken about honest motherhood, we've spoken about body positivity, and now your content's kind of gone in the direction of cycle breaking. So could you just tell us a little bit about kind of what that means and your experience of that?
Yeah, I think cycle breaking, there's a lot of misconceptions around it. So, cycle breaking is essentially being someone who can acknowledge that you have had things within your childhood or perhaps your parents' parenting that you don't want to carry forward into your own parenting. It's about breaking those generational trauma cycles. And when we talk about that, when people hear the word trauma, they quite often think of, these big catastrophic things, and that must mean that their parents were awful. And in some cases, mine, that is absolutely accurate. And it's a really big shift. And in other cases, people who consider themselves cycle breakers are making small changes. They're challenging what was perhaps the generational norm when they were children or when their parents were children, and making small changes for their children so that they can break those cycles.
Definitely. Do you think that we're all kind of cycle breakers in some sense? Because I feel like all of us will want to make some sort of, even if it's a tiny change to how we were parented, whether that is a generational thing or, as you said, something bigger.
I think we all can be. I think it takes something to acknowledge for some people that actually they might look back on their childhood and think, well, there was quite a few things I didn't like there. And actually being able to acknowledge that and say, hey, I can say on the one hand, my parents did their best, if that is something that you can say and you do feel is accurate, whilst also actually that caused me damage. And I think when we spoke before about body positivity, that links in quite a lot with people who are cycle breakers and perhaps don't realize that they are, because generationally, we've had different ideas of what different body types should look like, what is the ideal. And most of us can say that they remember their mum saying, oh, diet starts Monday, or, oh, I can't eat that because it'll make me fat, or, oh, look at all the weight I've put on. Whereas now we're becoming much more aware of the impact that that has on our children and breaking that cycle. So I think in some ways, yes, we all will be cycle breakers. We'll all make those changes, those choices. And to some degree, other people are taking the blueprint that they were given from their parents and going, we're going to just throw this out. This is not for me, and making the biggest changes. And then there are things that people acknowledge within their family unit that are dysfunctional, that have caused harm, but have been a learned behavior throughout generations, and are making those conscious choices to change that. So I think, yeah, we can be.
Yeah, absolutely. I know in my experience, my mum absolutely did her best with what she had, but she was a massive perfectionist, and we always had to look perfect, behave perfectly, not behave like children. And I see her trying to put that onto my children now. Like whenever my kids look a little bit scruffy, she's like, oh, you look like you've been dragged through a bush backwards. Or if they're acting like children in public, she's like, no, you need to stop that. So that's my way of cycle breaking. But I absolutely do acknowledge that she learnt that behaviour from her mum, and she was doing the best that she could with what she had.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said for acknowledging that two truths can be true. And there might be people listening there thinking, well, hang on a minute, no, because you can choose not to do those things. So is that doing your best? I think that we can say that on one hand, our parent did the best that they could, whilst also causing harm. And whilst also creating traumas within us that we now need to address, that we now need to change. For some people, that might not be relevant, and their parents might not have tried their best. But
Yeah.
ultimately, it's about looking at, as opposed to thinking, I think people quite often think of cycle breaking as like a blame game. And it's not. It's a case of acknowledging, yeah, this is something that she did. There was a lot of perfectionism there, might have created a lot of perfectionist tendencies in me, and a lot of anxiety, a lot of worry, a lot of self-pressure, a lot of shame. And that's not something I want for my children. So whilst I'm going to acknowledge that that might not have been her intent, that's okay, that it still caused me harm. And I'm still saying to her, don't do that to my kids. And as well, if we look at those things, they were very normal generational things. Our parents grew up in a largely kids should be seen, not heard society. That was the general gist. That was the idea. And even now you see it where people will say, oh, kids are so unruly nowadays. Are they, or are they just being allowed to be children?
Yeah.
It's about the way in which society changes and adapts, and the way in which we acknowledge certain things that were absolutely not acceptable, but were then.
Yeah, definitely. You see that so much now, don't you, of kids sort of getting told off for just being kids, and I'm so often like setting boundaries with the people around me, like, no, you don't need to tell them off. They're just being kids. They're not being naughty. Like, they're not hitting, they're not hurting people or doing anything to hurt anyone. So just let them be kids.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that's the key element there, is finding that balance between, is what they're doing hurting others? Is what they're doing causing perhaps, say you're out for a lovely meal and your kids are flicking food backwards and forwards. They're not, might not be hurting anybody, but they're certainly disrupting everybody else. Is what they're doing really a problem here? Or are we just conditioned to believe that actually children should sit there nice and quietly, not interfere with the adult business, not be involved in this? And there are so many ways in which that shows up in our society. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that sometimes these were generational norms before, sometimes they were family norms before, and sometimes some things were just downright unfair. And we're okay to say that.
Yeah, definitely. This podcast is proudly sponsored by Cover My Bubble. Emma and Chris lost their baby girl Lily Beth at 1 month old and faced financial struggles on top of their grief due to not having life insurance. Now they help others by offering insurance for parents, children and bumps, covering critical illness to income protection. Visit covermybubble.co.uk to cover your bubble. Do you mind talking us through how you were parented?
Yeah, sure, buckle in. I very much grew up in a toxic household. So I would not have told you that 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I would have said, my mum is my best friend. And I had what we would consider a very enmeshed relationship, a very codependent relationship with my mum. And growing up, my parents separated when I was about 4. They had an incredibly toxic divorce, with my dad marrying the person that he'd been having an affair with. And she was very toxic with her behavior. It was never really about putting the child first in that scenario and saying, how can we work around all of this stuff that we've got going on and make it safe, comfortable, happy for her. It was so much about weaponizing backwards and forwards. And I think there was an element with my mum. My dad was very neglectful. It was like out of sight, out of mind. And I do think there was still an element for my mum of creating that alienation. My mum did a lot of what we would call parentification, which is where for me, it was emotional parentification, which is where she essentially treated me as her therapist, as her spouse, as her best friend, which is where this notion of my child is my best friend comes from. There was nothing that we didn't talk about. And I am talking from the age of, 4 onwards, really. I remember sitting and listening to my parents' divorce court transcripts and this kind of thing, being told all of that information. We'd talk about sex to degrees that are not age appropriate. There was nothing that I didn't talk with my mum about. And what that created for me, and creates for a lot of people who experience that emotional parentification, and there is also instrumental parentification, which people might recognize. I had much less of that. There were some degrees of it. Instrumental parentification is when you would take on the roles of the parent, but in a physical manner. So it might be looking after the children, the younger children. It might be paying the bills. It might be doing the household chores. And there were certainly some elements of managing my mum's financial situations as I became a teenager, but much more for me, it was the emotional side. And what it creates is this real lack of sense of self. I don't feel like I really had any idea who I was until I was 30, and until I started to really pull away from my mum. And I felt very much like I had to be the good, loyal daughter, that it was always just me and my mum. Anyone else that came into our lives was kind of like an extra person. Even when I met my spouse, my mum still continued to live with us. And I actually bought my childhood home and built my mum an annex on the property so that she could continue to live with us. And whilst that might work for some people, it certainly wasn't a healthy dynamic for me. And it certainly wasn't something that, once I had my children, I started to recognize that these things were maybe not so healthy, and that there was a lot of expectation placed on me. There was a lot of codependence. I wouldn't make decisions without asking my mum, but would frequently be told, oh, well, you make all the decisions in the house. There was so much subtle emotional manipulation. And I think when I look back at my experiences with my mum, knowing what I know now, there was a lot of narcissistic behaviors. And we talk a lot, or we hear a lot online of, this person's a narcissist, this person does this. Narcissism is a lot more prevalent than we think. We all have an element of narcissism. There is healthy narcissism. And there has been a lot of people who have experienced narcissistic behaviors and narcissistic parents. That doesn't necessarily mean that we are diagnosing someone with narcissistic personality disorder, but that they have those traits that are incredibly toxic. The emotional manipulation, the gaslighting, the constant sense of debt mindset, which was really prevalent in my upbringing. This sense of, well, I've sacrificed all of this for you, you owe me. I never had another relationship with a partner because I wanted you to be happy, but she did frequently, but you owe me. And it was always that kind of mentality. And I remember her saying to me once, well, I'll help you get on the property ladder. And then in the next breath, but you're going to leave me. And it was real, that kind of manipulation, that continual weaponization of, you owe me for having raised you and for having done it all without your dad's support. And I'm owed something from you. And eventually it got to a point where I'd recognized so many of these behaviors. They were beginning to really impact not just me, but my family, my partner, and our relationship, my kids, especially my oldest, who my mum really seemed to zone in on. And there are a lot of similarities between myself and my eldest child. And I think that certainly led to her almost feeling like she was about to have a do-over, which is something that I speak to a lot with clients who have several children. They find their eldest child is very much a target for their parents, or sometimes the eldest boy, or sometimes the eldest girl, depending on the parent and the way that they are. And once I started to recognize that these things were not healthy and that these were really impacting my children, I'd gone to my mum and said to her, we'd agreed before we bought the house and built the annex that if things were not going right, you would move out and we would make sure you got a property, and that you were in exactly the same position you would be if you sold the house, which we'd been paying for years anyway, to a complete stranger. You're not going to struggle here. You're not going to miss out. There's nothing. We've agreed this. We didn't agree it in writing. So mum's point of view was, I'm not going to leave. I'm going to stay here, even if it makes you miserable, even if it destroys your relationship, causes problems for your children. I don't care. I am entitled to stay here. You will buy me a car. You will continue to cook dinner for me every night. You will continue to do all these things. And for the first time, really, in my life, I said no. And what ensued was, I think, it was like 6 month-ish legal battle to remove her from the house, which we eventually won. And she was exactly as we'd promised, reimbursed anything that she'd, she was put in the same position she would have been as if she'd have sold the house to a complete stranger. Better actually, because she added interest, but that's by the by. Well, I say that's by the by. I think we have a real habit of saying, oh, that's by the by, or oh, that's fine. And I was speaking to somebody else on another podcast last week about how we have a habit of saying, oh, it's fine, even after we say something horrendous. And actually, that's not fine. A parent should not add interest and should not charge their child thousands and thousands of pounds for essentially saying, I'm miserable, you living with me. Let's do what we agreed beforehand. So no, that wasn't by the by, that was horrendous. But it was just another added thing. And at the time, I remember even after I'd asked my mum to leave and she'd said no, she sent me a text message about a week later and we hadn't spoken after that. And I was very much of the opinion, right, that is it. We need some breathing space. We need some calm. I'm not going to have contact with her right now. I'm okay. It's safe. We will get through this. And the text message just said, Harry, my Sky's not working. Can you come and fix it for me? And it was this real disconnect then that I just thought, wow, she really doesn't get it. She thinks this is going to be the same as it's always been of, we'll have this massive argument, if there are any arguments, where I dare to strive for my own autonomy, where I dare to be my own person and she doesn't like it, or I bush up against her values because mine are different. And then it'll just be brushed under the carpet. That was very much a theme throughout our entire relationship was she could say the most horrendous things. She could be the most horrendous person. I remember her saying to me once, well, you killed your baby, when I'd had to have a termination. And I'd said, why would you say that? And she'd said, well, I wanted to hurt you. And it was never spoken of again. It was just the kind of relationship that we had where she could say these really awful things, sometimes in front of the kids. And then it would be, oh, well, I'm allowed to do that because I'm your mum. And eventually she did move out. Eventually we did manage to get our home back. And we have not had contact personally since. We have had instances where she's tried to have access to the children, where she's tried to get in touch with the children, even though we'd expressed that that was not suitable, because a lot came out from our kids of how she'd been treating them, especially my eldest, and a lot of really unacceptable behaviour towards them. Very much what I remember of my childhood, very much trying to cause a rift between myself and my husband and our child. And just the kind of things that you need to set boundaries with, and that people who had a somewhat difficult relationship may have been able to manage with setting boundaries, but that we said, no, if you're not safe to be around us, you're not going to be around our kids. That's done. So we've had a few instances of her turning up at the school, trying to arrange secret meetings with the kids, thinking that that was acceptable. Unfortunately, our eldest was very much immediately told us what had happened, immediately said, this has happened. She's told me not to say. She said she'll come back tomorrow. What do I do? So it's been about 3 years, nearly 4, I think, since I've had contact with her. And I feel like it was the start of my life, being able to step away from that and being able to really step into who I am as a person and being able to jump into my own autonomy and be my own parent. There's a lot that I, especially in the earlier days, recognized that were repeated cycles and that I have had to change with my own parent and hold myself accountable as well to my eldest and have those difficult conversations with him. And I feel like it's been so many big changes.
Definitely. I think it's amazing that you've even been able to step out of that relationship and be able to set those boundaries like in the beginning and then actually come away completely, because so many people will just feel quite stuck in that relationship because it damages your self-worth. It makes you feel like you're the problem. So quite often you stay because you feel that kind of relationship where you feel like you are dependent on them. So it's incredibly brave that you have been able to step away. But at what point did you kind of start to realise what was actually going on?
I think that was when I had my children. And I just want to, you'd mentioned there, a lot of people feel stuck. And I think there's so much shame around acknowledging that your parent is not who you thought they were, and acknowledging that you don't owe them anything. Our children don't owe us anything. And that's a real challenging perception when you've been brought up in these toxic households with emotionally unavailable parents, emotionally immature parents, narcissistic parents. It's all the same thing, actually. But when you've been brought up with those kind of parents, that is so difficult to step away from that feeling of shame, because toxic parents will create what we'd call fog, and they dictate by that, and it is fear, obligation, and guilt. And those things are so powerful. And when that is the underpinning part of your relationship, when that is the foundation of your being that they have created, of who you are allowed to be, it's nearly impossible to step away from it. And many, many people don't. But I would say to you, if you are listening and you are thinking, gosh, that sounds a lot like my parent, and I wish that I could pull away from that, you absolutely can. And it is okay to say, I'm going to step away. You don't have to have a relationship with a parent who treats you badly. But it was really when I had my own children that I would start to reflect on things that happened in my childhood. When I talk with clients, there is nothing that will trigger you like thinking about your own children and seeing your children at various stages. And one of the things that we quite often do in coaching and in therapy is looking at building a lifeline of, it's like a timeline of your life and all of the events that have happened. And these can be really impactful events. It's not going to be everything. It's not going to be, I first started brushing my teeth on a Tuesday. And it's every big impactful event that's happened, be it positive or negative. And looking at those things, recognizing, okay, when my parents separated when I was 4, for example, that would have been a big life event for me. Seeing my children at a similar age brings back a lot of those memories, and your children will resurface a lot of those memories that you have been suppressing, and a lot of those things that you might recognize something happening to them and think, I have a really uncomfortable feeling around this and I don't like it and I don't know why. But actually, when you dig into it, it's because similar events happened to you, or it's triggered some kind of memory from when you were a child. And I think that exercise is really interesting for people if they want to give it a go. It can be quite confronting, but it is quite interesting to see, oh, hang on, no wonder I found it difficult when my child was this age, because that came up for me. So I would definitely recommend to listeners to give it a go if they feel able, and if they're wanting to dig a bit more into their childhood and that inner child work. But for me, the realizations really did start to come when I had my own kids, and when I would recognize my mum's behavior towards the kids. There is a real fierceness that comes as a parent with wanting to defend your children, and it is almost instinctual for so many of us to step forward and have that, we call it the mama bear, don't we, and have that kind of jump in attitude of, you not my child. And I remember that coming up so often and feeling that frustration with her and thinking, that's not acceptable. That's not, I remember you doing that with me and it hurt, and you're not going to do that with them.
Yeah, definitely. But how do you go about setting those boundaries? Because I feel like it would be very difficult if it's your first time noticing those behaviors towards your children. How do you go about setting those boundaries in a healthy way?
Yeah, boundaries are one of my favorite things to work on. And I think boundaries are, again, they get a bad rep. We hear about people in the news who, or the media paints them very much as, I live by these arbitrary rules that you have to follow. And boundaries are not about anybody else. They are about you and what you find acceptable. Any boundary is absolutely okay when it talks about you and gives people choice and respects their autonomy. So say, for example, and I always use this particular analogy because I think it's quite, I think it's or this particular example because I think it's quite an easy one for people to relate to, but it's not too deep. Say you have a parent who consistently feeds your child something that you have asked them not to. And regardless of how often you say, oh, don't bring that over here, maybe they've got allergies, or maybe you just don't want them eating that food, you would say to your parent, hey, we don't usually like it if little Timmy has a can of Coke before he comes home. We don't let him have fizzy drinks, so I would appreciate it if you didn't give that to him, and then that's it. That's your boundary. It's as simple as that. It's saying, please don't give my child this. You don't have to add a consequence when you do, and it's called a boundary traffic light system, which is coined by somebody called Melissa Urban. And I really love this way of teaching people boundaries. So you start off with a simple one like that of, hey, mum, dad, we don't give Timmy Coke before. We don't give Timmy Coke. We don't let him have fizzy drinks. So I'd really appreciate it if you didn't give him any of that. Okay, thank you. Then the next time you see them either giving the thing that you've asked them not to, you would go to what we'd call a yellow level boundary, and you would say, hey, we had a conversation about not giving fizzy drinks. I'd really appreciate it if you stuck to what we said and you didn't give him fizzy drinks. It makes him feel really uncomfortable, gives him a tummy ache afterwards. We don't want him to have them. If you continue to do that, he won't be able to come over without us anymore. And you've set your consequence in that yellow stage. So breaking them down in this stage, a lot of people think that you put a boundary in place and you set this boundary and you've got to give out this consequence. And if you do this, I will never give you another chance. That's unrealistic in relationships. But giving that sort of soft warning with that green boundary and then moving to the yellow or amber stage and saying, we did tell you this, and there is going to be a consequence if you keep doing it because it gives our child tummy ache, or we don't like it, whatever your reasoning. You don't even have to give a reason. It's just a simple, this is not going to happen for us. And then finally, if it's crossed again, you can do a red boundary, which would be, mum, dad, we did tell you not to give him fizzy drinks. You've continued to do so. He'll now no longer be coming over without us. That's the end of it. And you follow through on the action. Boundaries always are about you and about having what's your preference and what works for you. So it might be, for example, yourself saying, please don't talk about my weight. It really hurts me and it makes me feel really uncomfortable. That's your green boundary. Mum, I told you not to talk about my weight. If you start picking at me whilst I'm at the dinner table, I'm going to get up and leave and I won't come round for dinner anymore. And then your red boundary would be, I did tell you not to speak about my weight. You keep doing it. I've told you it hurts me. You've ignored that, and leave. And you can break them down into these much more palatable ways. And I think for a lot of people, they forget that in relationships, they're give and take, and we are constantly learning. And for some people, you might find somebody say, well, my parent keeps crossing my boundary, but then they'll follow it up when I call them out on it and go, oh, I'm really sorry. I forgot you don't like that. Yeah, I didn't realize that. And they're willing to make an effort and to meet you part way. And it's not done maliciously, but actually there does need to be a boundary there. Your boundary matters. Your boundary is valid. And if you don't want your child having sweets or you don't want somebody to talk about your weight, that's valid. That's okay. And you have every right to set that boundary. But we can give a little bit of lenience. And I think when it comes to something like talking about your weight or doing something that they know is hurting you, we can be a little bit less lenient, a little bit less give and take, and a bit more rigid. But boundaries change as well as we develop, as we grow, and that's okay. I think people feel sometimes with boundaries that they must be this rigid thing that never flexes, that you're given one chance to get right and then that's it, or that it's a rule that controls other people. Even when we say to our parents, please don't talk about my weight, we're not saying to them, you can't do that. We're saying, if you do that, it hurts me. You choose whether you hurt me or not. But if you do, it's going to have a reaction from me. And that's where the difference between a boundary and trying to control someone comes in. You're saying, look, you can choose to do that. You can choose to behave that way. You can choose to ignore what I'm saying to you. But what I'm asking is really reasonable here. And ultimately, I'm going to pull away from you if you continue to behave that way. And I think with boundaries, the most crucial thing is there is never a point in setting a boundary and saying this will be the consequence of you crossing it if you're not going to follow through with that consequence.
Yeah. And then if those boundaries aren't working and they keep breaking those boundaries and you're kind of at the point where you're deciding, I think it's time that we now cut this person out, how do you go about doing that in a healthy way? Because I know with a narcissist, for example, you're supposed to just cut all ties.
It's really difficult, and it's going to look different for every single person. Obviously, in my experience, it was quite cataclysmic. If there had been the opportunity to have some kind of conversation where I could have put proper boundaries in place and I could have had them respected to some degree, that would be a lot easier. For most people, in my experience working with clients, what it tends to look like is gradually stepping back. For some people, it will happen with a big event, and there will be an immediate cut of contact, an immediate, I've had enough of this, I can't cope with this anymore, we are done. And that's okay. That's okay for that event to happen and for you to say, we're done. If you feel able, you can communicate that I don't want any contact from you anymore. I always say to people, if they do choose to go down that route where they do want to communicate, I don't want contact from you anymore, it's often better in written form, whatever format you take, because then there is less immediacy in the moment. There's less for them to gaslight or to weaponize and to come back and say, you do this, or to guilt you or shame you or make you feel like you've done something wrong. You can write out a very nice email, letter, text message that says, look, your actions here were unacceptable. I'm going to need some time away from the relationship and I wish you well. And that's it. And you don't have to add that I wish you well if you don't feel like it. Lots of people are like, but I don't wish them well. I'm like, don't add it then. But I think it's important to realize, and I say to everybody who does want to do that, write 2 letters. Write one that pours all your emotion, that shares everything that's hurt you, that almost leeches the wound and lets you get all of that out of you. And then write the letter that you're actually going to send, that doesn't give any of that, that just says, this event has hurt me, or I'm going to need some distance from this for whatever reason. And that in itself is enough. But having that second option of pouring everything into a letter can be really, really soothing for getting it out of you. Sometimes people will say to me, but I feel really like I'm gagged. I want to say to my parent, you did this and you did that. And you have to ask yourself, what is the end goal there? Because is your parent going to respond in the way that you want? Are they going to be accountable? Are we going to see a repair to the rupture that's been caused, which is really important with your own children, because there will be ruptures that will be caused. There always are in relationships. But if we've got to a point with a parent where we're thinking about cutting ties completely, that's because there hasn't been any accountability. And how many times are you going to give them the option to try and be accountable, to try and repair the rupture at the sacrifice of your own mental health and the sacrifice of your own well-being, before you say, I'm not going to give you that chance. I'm just going to say enough is enough.
Yeah.
If you do find that there hasn't been a big event, but you just want to gradually step back, you can also do that. And you can set those boundaries in terms of parents saying, well, I've been ringing you and you've not been answering. Well, I'm really busy at the minute, Mum. I will contact you when I'm available, and just slowly step back. I think a lot of people feel guilt that they don't give an explanation, but you've been giving an explanation your whole life if you've got to the point where you're considering cutting contact.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And now, kind of moving forward to your parenting now, how are you kind of parenting differently to how you were parented?
Yeah, parenting, there's this misconception again with cycle breaking parenting that you think you always get it right. If I had a penny for every person that turned around and said to me, oh, so I guess you think you're the perfect parent, including my own parent, I am far from perfect. As I said earlier, there have been things that I have recognized that were repeated patterns from when I was a child, that I've had to go to my eldest son and say, hey, look, I did this with you when you were little, and I am so sorry. That was really wrong of me. I didn't know better, but I do know better now, and I'm striving to do better. And one of the things that's very important for me is to teach them to have boundaries with me. And that can be in little ways. So, for example, I knock on their doors. That is teaching them a boundary. That's their space. And within the parameters of it being safe and hygienic, they're allowed to have whatever they want in their bedroom, do their bedroom how they want. I had this conversation with my teenager the other day. He was like, but I just want to stack the boxes against the wall. And I'm like, dude, they will fall. And I can't let you do that. And he was like, you said it was my space. I was like, I did, but I'm also the adult. and I have to be responsible for you. And I'm very much trying and always striving to find balance. I think when we have had a toxic upbringing, regardless of what that has looked like, whether we've had a very authoritarian parent who is a big shouter, very much my way or the highway, it's my house, you'll do as I say, you have to behave this way. Or we've had a permissive parent who there's a lot of parentification, treats you very much like a friend as opposed to the child-adult relationship that we need, that is fundamental to our development, and lets you really do whatever you want. We tend to think of it as like a pendulum. We tend to swing completely the opposite to what our parents were like if we had a negative experience. And what we need is to kind of be in that middle place where we have some things where we have to set boundaries. We have some things where we have to say no, where we have to be the bad guy. You know, if I let my teenager, he would not go to school because he doesn't like it. He's having a really bad time at school. That was actually my experience. I had about 20% attendance at one point because my mum was just like, yeah, whatever. If you don't want to go, I can't make you. I'm not going to be the bad guy. Sometimes we've got to be the bad guy, and we've got to be, your kids will turn around to you and be like, you're so mean. And that's really hard as a cycle breaker because you want to be like, I'm not, I promise. I just have to say, dude, you've got to go to school, or you've got to brush your teeth, or you've got to do this. So we have to have some boundaries, and we have to have some rules. And sometimes we have to be the bad guy. But equally, we have to be able to do that collaboratively. Their voice matters, their opinions matter, developing their sense of self matters. And I think that is part of what is missed in authoritarian parenting, where you have someone who's very much the dictator, my way or the highway, everyone walks on eggshells around them. And it's that lack of sense of self that can be really damaging for a child. So I'm constantly striving to be in the middle, and I don't always get it right. And one of the biggest parts for cycle breaking parenting is realizing that when you get it wrong, it's okay. You have to be accountable. And, you know, your kids will quite often point it out to you when you get it wrong. If you are getting it right most of the time and teaching them that their voice matters and teaching them that you will be accountable and that you're safe to come to and say, hey, look, you messed up here. You were a dick. That is okay. Maybe you don't want your 4-year-old coming and saying that to you, but I assure you a 13-year-old will. And I think it's important to have that space where you can say to them, you know what? You're right. I was wrong there. I am really sorry. And now I'm aware of it. I'm going to do better, and changing that behavior and adapting and acknowledging that you're human and you will make mistakes. There will be times when perhaps your parent, as much as you had a negative experience with them, will pop out of you because that's the blueprint that you were given. And this is the generational trauma that you will carry. It's okay in those moments because you have the power to change that, challenge that, adapt to that.
Yeah, amazing. Before we spin the wheel, I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming on and doing this episode. There will be so many people out there who are struggling with this, who maybe want to be the cycle breaker but don't know where to start, or I don't know, parenting can be a bit of a minefield sometimes, and you just, all of the things coming at you like gentle parenting, responsive parenting. But listening to this episode, I think you can quite easily just look at yourself as not being perfect but trying to do better, and these little ways of just making children feel more heard. So thank you so much for coming on and doing this.
Thank you for having me. I think that for me is one of the most important things, is that people realize no one's expecting perfection from you, including your children. I didn't need my mum to be perfect. I needed her to hear me when she was hurting me. And
Yeah.
that's a thread that I see throughout every person that I speak to. Nobody is expecting perfection. They're just expecting a bit of accountability.
Yeah, I love that. Right, let's do the wheel. Right, you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Let's see what we get. Oh, you got a rank bank, Harriet.
Oh no. Okay, go on then.
So these are basically disgusting motherhood stories that have been sent in by our audience, and they are truly gag worthy. So I'm going to put a gag warning up front here because some of them are proper gross. We did that one last time. Let's have a look. Here we go. So, I was around my friend's house with my 2 kids and her 3 kids. We were sat having coffee while the 4 eldest played upstairs in my bedroom and my youngest played in front of us on the floor. Luckily, I looked over at my friend's 8-month-old in the nick of time. She had bum shuffled over to the cat litter, had a handful of it, poop and all, and was about to ram it in her mouth. It was literally millimetres away from her lips when I grabbed her.
Oh.
You've got cats as well.
Been there.
Oh, really?
There. We've got cats. It's a miracle that you won't have heard the cat throughout this. And they're indoor cats, so we've got cat litter. And the amount of times that I've had to literally grab and like slide back a child because they've been heading towards it. And you think, no, why would you touch that? In what possible reality could you want to touch that? It stinks. But yeah.
I don't know why kids go for like the most disgusting things. Like kids will eat like dirt and sand, and it's like, I don't understand why. And yet they won't eat the spaghetti bolognese that I cook them. These children, honestly. But they're a bit older now. I presume they stay away from the cat litter.
You know what? They avoid it like the plague. Even when I'm like, but it's your cat. He's like, yeah, but you're my parent, so you be responsible.
Your job is the cat litter.
No. So they very much avoid it now.
Oh, bless them. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming back on again. It's been really amazing talking to you about our 3rd different topic. Honestly, you're like a font of all knowledge with all these different topics you've come on here with.
It's ADHD.
Oh, yeah. I feel you.
I've just discovered it's ADHD. It makes a lot of sense. I'm like, why do I always love different topics? I'm like, oh, no, wait. No, that makes sense.
Yeah, it cracks me up because on my 100th episode party, everyone that came on the couch was like, yep, ADHD. I was like, do I just attract these people into my life?
Yeah, what it is, it surprises me because I was like, no, this is just good old-fashioned trauma. This is not ADHD. And there's so many people that I'm now discovering it links so much. I think so many women, especially in their 30s, are now being diagnosed in 30s, 40s, 50s because their children have discovered it. And the amount of people that I've spoken to since I've discovered it in the last couple of weeks who've said, well, you know, it's not just me who's worked out that I have ADHD because of my kid getting diagnosed, but also my mum.
Yeah.
And it's like, how have we missed all of these people? It makes so much sense.
Yeah, I've worked it out that it's my mum as well. I'm like, Mum, you've definitely got ADHD. She's like, yeah, I probably do, but you know, I'm 50 now. I'm not going to do anything about it. And I'm like, yeah, you probably should.
Yeah, it would be helpful. I'm just saying, like, it would be a decent idea. But no, I've been.
We'll have to have you back for another episode about ADHD.
Probably, to be honest.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and thank you so much to everyone for watching, for listening at home. Please don't forget to download, subscribe, like, whatever platform you're on. And yeah, we'll see you next week.
Bye.